Okay, procedural legitimacy, I think, is what is getting liberal societies in trouble. It's what getting liberal politics in trouble. As long as you follow procedure, even if you elect people that are completely incompetent, even if you elect people that are selfish, that are corrupt, that don't deliver, you're still legitimate. We don't want that. We want leaders who get their legitimacy by delivering. If you can deliver the goods, you are legitimate. You know, so I think the West, especially America, have been extraordinarily arrogant. You've been lecturing everybody so much everywhere around the world. You're so used to lecturing people and humiliating people, you don't think you're humiliating them. And finally, you got somebody who's grown big enough and say, no, we're not going to take that anymore. And you think they're thin-skinned. And that's the case.
大家好，我是老吴。上一期我们看到李世默面对香港外国记者会前主席、资深媒体人基斯里奇伯格的连环发问，从中共的自我革新、年轻人的支持到历史观问题，他都给出了相当有力的回应。那这一集基斯又会从哪些角度继续发难呢？这一段的焦点进一步聚焦在几个更敏感也更核心的议题上，比如中国共产党的权力这么集中，内部到底有没有制衡？他怎么面对社会上的不同声音，甚至是所谓的意见？还有一个更关键的问题，中共的执政合法性到底从哪里来？它跟西方那套程序民主和普选制度有什么根本的不同？除此之外，主持人也提出了几个在西方舆论场上常见的批评，比如中国是不是太玻璃心？在新冠疫情初期是不是不够透明？面对这些更刁钻、更直接的质疑，李世默会怎么回应？他对中国式民主的解释，对中共合法性的理解，又能不能说服你我？一起来看看这场更进一步的精彩对话。
Let me just ask you a couple more questions here. First of all, the party used to, and one of its other strengths, I mentioned one strength was always self-criticism. Another one was it always allowed a lot of decentralization and a lot of innovation at the local level. And when I was covering China, there was a lot of stuff with grassroots democracy going on in villages and in counties. I don't hear about that anymore. It seems to be more of a top-down, no innovation. And I've never even heard anybody speaking about this kind of village elections or grassroots democracy. What happened?
Well, the pendulum does swing from one period to another. You know, and in the history of the People's Republic, the pendulum has swung several times between decentralization and centralization. Okay, and it will take too long to go into that history.
I know the cyclical history.
Right, but you know, we had a period of decentralization for a couple of decades, and it's now swinging towards more centralized power. I think that's correct. Driven by changes in circumstances and the needs of the development of the country. But I'll tell you, there's still tremendous amount of innovation and policy innovation and economic activities at the local level. So I was just in Suzhou, I was in Yiwu, other, you know, different cities in China, different counties. The county governments, provincial governments, they're being very aggressive in coming up with economic development policies that work within the specific circumstances in the regions they're in. Very aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Wang Yang, when he was in charge of Guangzhou, was credited with a lot of innovative policies there, and he moved up to the center. But, you know, I mentioned, you know, self-criticism was always a strength. Local decentralization and local innovation was always a strength. A third strength, I think, and people have credited this, was always collective leadership. You know, nobody got too powerful and leaders stepped aside. Does China still have that kind of collective leadership?
Well, that's also the pendulum does swing. And has swung for many times between collective and more centralized, more collective, less collective. You know, during the 16th and 18th Party Congress, those 10 years, they had 9 members on the standing committee of the Politburo. It was, you know, bigger than before. So the pendulum swung toward, you know, a greater collection, a larger number of people at the top, and there's something good about it, but also it led to certain inefficiencies, certain power being diffused, and now they're in a new phase. So they shrank it at the 16th Party Congress back to 7. And then, of course, we have a leader that seems to be more powerful than leaders in the past. But the pendulum does swing. I mean, I think it is still the decisions are made by the Central Committee under the leadership of the party Secretary General and the Standing Committee of the Party Bureau. That system, those institutions stay intact.
Is it fair to say, and you may disagree with me here, but is it fair to say that the party, at least with this new centralized leadership and Xi Jinping in power, they don't like dissent? I mean, they don't like criticism. They don't like dissent. There have been academics who've been, lost their jobs for dissenting. There have been bloggers who've been arrested. My question is, where are the checks and balances if you've got that much power centralized and you don't like criticism, you don't like dissent?
Well, I'm not so sure the kind of dissent that you have in liberal societies and how productive that is. The kind of dissent that you're talking about, I mean, I assure you, there are a lot of criticism in China. There are a lot of differences of opinions within the party institution when they discuss policies at different levels, lots of debates. And all the policy decisions that come out at the end are results of debates, vigorous debates. I know that for a fact. But the kind of dissent that you're talking about, I don't think we need in this country. Just look at the countries that have it. They're not being governed very effectively. They are polarized. Their governments dysfunctional. Their people hate each other. Their medias hate each other. We don't want that.
Okay, but I mean, when you think about it, that's a good answer. But when you think about it, the party, 92 million members, that's only 6% of the population of China, which is about 1.3 to 1.4 billion. Can 6% of the population really represent, the entire population of China?
It is bigger than what I call the Holy Trinity that runs America. The Holy Trinity, America is also in some way a one-party state, and it's run by a party called the Holy Trinity. I call it Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood. Mm-hmm. These three groups of people, including the nannies that they employ, no more than 1 million people. They make all the decisions in America. That's why you have all these dissatisfaction in the country.
Well, some people would add in the gun lobby and a lot of others in there as well.
Gun lobby too.
Into that trinity. Yeah. But seriously, I mean, what are the checks and balances in a one-party state? What if Xi Jinping's got something wrong?
Let me tell you, without real checks and balances, the party will not have survived this long. Okay, so when we talk about all these abstract concepts like checks and balances or democracy for that matter, okay, we ought not only focus on procedure. We ought to focus on outcome. Okay, when you have these really beautiful things like checks and balances and democracy and people's will, when you have them, the outcome should be success. Success means people are satisfied and their lives are getting better and they look towards the future with optimism and society is cohesive. Okay, I don't care what kind of procedures you have. If you don't achieve those outcomes, I don't think you're democratic. I don't think these checks and balances do any good.
So are you one of those who believes that the East is rising and the West is in decline?
Well, I wouldn't put it in those terms. I mean, I'm one that I hope liberal societies could rejuvenate themselves. Liberalism needs some self-criticism. Liberals in liberal societies should learn from the party state in China. The party state in China has been very good at self-criticism. That's why they reinvent themselves. Mm-hmm. You only reinvent yourself when you see problems. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, why would you reinvent yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So liberal societies have been failing at that for the past decades because they take their system for granted. They think there's some kind of moral imperative that somehow they take their system as a given that it works. It's the best thing you've got. So of course you don't need self-criticism. You don't need to reinvent yourself. I hope for a world where we have a degree of pluralism, a degree of plurality. Different kind of systems and ideologies could coexist and compete. So I wish liberalism well.
Well, let me ask a question that might be slightly provocative. Don't mean it to be, but I mean it, and I mean it with all seriousness. I mean, most people would say that the vast majority of Chinese support what the Communist Party has done and what the Communist Party is doing. Why don't they have an election? Like in Singapore, where the ruling party has been in power, they have elections to legitimize their rule every once in a while, and they continue to stay in power. But that kind of rejuvenates and allows them to claim legitimacy from the people.
Well, we have a system of selecting capable people from the population and move them up to lead the country. And they've proven to be great leaders and effective leaders. They have delivered. Countries, I mean, Singapore is a small place. I don't want to use it as an example. Okay, countries, especially big liberal societies, at least in the past few decades with your elections, have not been able to produce leaders that are capable and effective and can deliver. So the best way for you to convince the Chinese to have elections to make yours work.
Well, let me ask you the question then. Without elections, where does the Communist Party in China get its legitimacy? They were originally a revolutionary party. They won the war.
They get their legitimacy, like I said, based on outcome. Okay, procedural legitimacy, I think, is what is getting liberal societies in trouble. It's what getting liberal politics in trouble. As long as you follow procedure, even if you elect people that are completely incompetent, even if you elect people that are selfish, that are corrupt, that don't deliver, you're still legitimate. We don't want that. We want leaders who get their legitimacy by delivering. If you can deliver the goods, you are legitimate.
So it's performance-based legitimacy, correct?
Whatever you want to call it. I think democracy needs a set of new measurements. I think democracy needs to be measured by outcome, not by procedure.
But what happens in China if the economy suddenly collapses? You've got a demographic challenge looming ahead. You know, you could always have some economic problem with debt, et cetera. If the party is tying its fate to making people richer, how long can that go on? Again, the question,
I'm not sure
can China keep rising?
I'm not sure the party is tying itself by making people richer. I don't think it's the right term to put it. The party right now, like I said, in this current phase of reinvention, is tying itself with the future of China that's more equitable and productive, not making just a few rich. They want to lift everybody. Okay, they are tying their legitimacy with that mission. And I think most of Chinese people agree with that mission. And they need to succeed. If they fail, they'll lose legitimacy. Okay. If they succeed, they'll keep that legitimacy for a very, very long time.
Okay, so there's no need for any kind of election, no need for even a referendum on whether you support the party.
I've already said what I wanted to say. Like I said, if they deliver, they will have legitimacy. Okay, sure. We don't want a system where you hold a vote and you don't deliver and you're still legitimate. That's bad.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you something that often has me scratching my head, and a lot of outsiders who care about China have been following it a long time, scratching our heads, which is at the time when the party and President Xi are at the peak of power, China is about to become the world's top economy, if not already there. They're at the peak of their military success. Why are they so thin-skinned? Why is it that a basketball owner who I've never heard of can put out a tweet and all of a sudden it hurts the feelings of the Chinese people, so you take the NBA games off the air, or you can shut down a newspaper because it's running editorials that somehow are threatening the national security of China? I mean, why so thin-skinned? And particularly those young people you mentioned can be online very thin-skinned about what I consider very minor things.
I don't know. I think you got to put yourself in their shoes. I think the West, especially America, have been extraordinarily arrogant. You've been lecturing everybody so much everywhere around the world. You're so used to lecturing people and humiliating people, you don't think you're humiliating them. And finally, you got somebody who's grown big enough and say, no, we're not going to take that anymore. and you think they're thin-skinned. And if that's the case, that's okay.
Well, when a Chinese communist group puts on Twitter a picture of a rocket going up saying, here's China lighting a fire next to Indians cremating people because of the virus, and say, this is how we light a fire. This is how India lights a fire. Isn't that being arrogant?
I'm not sure. I've seen that picture before. I don't know what the intent of that picture is, but I think it expresses a particular view. It's a view that the Indian people are not being treated well. The leadership of India needs to have some self-criticism. It speaks for millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people in India that are suffering. I mean, how can you, there's nothing wrong with that.
How about when
think about these people who are dying, who are sick, who are really being buried every day. You can't even put out a picture and say something for them.
How about when, I don't think that was, I think it was mocking India, quite frankly.
I don't know.
How about these Twitter accounts coming out from people in China and some of these young people you were talking about that were mocking New York because of the number of dead during the coronavirus, or they've been mocking they've been mocking Australia because of a situation that happened before with Afghanistan. Do you think that's winning friends?
No, I don't think, I don't know what you're referring to. If you're referring to the oil painting of an Australian soldier putting his knife in an Australian girl, I totally support it. I think it's a horrible thing these Australian soldiers did. Okay, and this is an artist rendition of the tragic events that took place in Afghanistan. It is not mocking. It is serious.
So you think these kind of wolf warrior?
It was a crime. It was a crime, and they needed. Yeah, an artist attempted to call it that, to show it to the world what happened. It was an artistic rendition. It wasn't a photograph. It was a painting.
And so you mentioned countries being arrogant. You don't think China is acting arrogant now?
I hope we won't be arrogant. All right. But even if we are, we're far behind someone else.
Well, let me ask you a question then. Another question. China's at the top, as I mentioned, they're at the top of their power economically, militarily, et cetera. But, I just looked at the recent Pew survey of 14 countries, and just excuse me for looking down, I want to get it accurate. Negative views of China have increased in every one of the countries that they surveyed. 81% negative in Australia, 74% in UK, Germany 71% negative, Spain 63% negative, South Korea 75% negative, US, Canada. I mean, the negative views of China and negative views of Xi Jinping in Asia and in Europe and in the US and Canada. Why is that?
I've seen those numbers, and it's very interesting until I noticed something else. Okay, I noticed a very interesting trend, and that sets China apart from these other countries, many of these countries. Okay, in China, we have two trends going in opposite directions. Okay, in China, we have the Chinese people's view of their own government, of their own country, is improving significantly. They're getting more and more positive. Yet, other peoples in other countries, their view of China have been deteriorating. Then you notice these people's views about their own countries and about their own governments are also deteriorating. So they're just unhappy.
Well, if you dig into those numbers, what it actually says, what the Pew report says, is that this negative view of China and negative view of Xi Jinping's ability to handle things are directly related to the coronavirus. And particularly because you mentioned, and I think it's correct, that once February of 2020 came along, China, with its lockdowns and quarantine, managed to handle the virus extremely well. But nobody likes to talk about what happened in December of 2019 and January of 2020, when they were locking up doctors and arresting bloggers who were trying to warn the world what was going on. Hey, why won't China become more transparent and allow people unfettered access to find out what happened?
Heath, we had our first known case of coronavirus at the end of December 2019, at the almost last few days of the year, okay? And we had the Wuhan lockdown in January 20-something. Merely 3 weeks passed from the first known case of a virus that's completely unknown to mankind to a complete lockdown of a major city and a major province in China that was also unprecedented in human history. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, we showed the world how serious this virus was in action. 3 months later, I mean 6 months later, in America and Europe, you were still debating whether you ought to wear masks.
Why were doctors being being called into the police for trying to tell the world
wait a minute. You can talk about all these specific events you want. I mean, I can go to America and find all these things that are happening in America. Okay, you guys were in America and Europe. You were debating whether, I mean, people were protesting about wearing masks. They're insulting people. Political leaders in America were insulting American people for wearing masks.
Nobody's defending America. We're talking about China here.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is you got to cut people some slack. You can't be too arrogant. Okay, don't be too arrogant. We had 3 weeks. It took us 3 weeks, like I said, from the first known case of coronavirus, of a virus that was completely unknown to the world, ever in history. It took us 3 weeks to shut down an entire city of 10 million people.
There were supposed to be
enough to show the world how serious it was.
There was supposed to be some information sharing that was set up after the SARS epidemic between doctors in China and the world, and that didn't happen.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. You got to read the history. The genome sequence of the coronavirus was put into NIH in Bethesda and shared with the world, I think, in the first 2 weeks of January. Like I said, again, it took us 10 days, took China 10 days, maybe 2 weeks to share the genome sequence with the entire world. Okay, look, we're all at the same starting point. I mean, everybody was surprised by the virus. I mean, we weren't geniuses here. It took us some time to figure out whether it was serious to begin with, okay? And it took us 3 weeks. We showed the world in action how serious it was. We locked down Wuhan. We locked down Hubei province. Okay, nobody's ever done it in human history.
Well, look, I'm not going to go back and debate the history of that, but what I want to ask you, the question is, again, I'm going back to these negative views of China, which, if you believe the surveys, a lot of that is tied to the coronavirus and a feeling, and it may be inaccurate, a feeling that China's not being 100% transparent. When countries like Australia, for example, have asked for an international investigation, China says we're going to cut off trade. I mean, come on. Why are they being so resistant to a real investigation so we can find out how this thing happened?
We can argue all day long about how open they were to investigations. At least China was the only country that did allow WHO to come in and investigate. No other country has done that. I mean, you have countries that have 10, 100 times more deaths, 1,000 times more infections. You know, why isn't the WHO being called to go investigate there?
Because the virus first was identified in Wuhan, and they're trying to find out if it came from the wet market or if it was an accidental lab leak.
But what about how it spread so quickly?
Well, maybe it spread because that lockdown of Wuhan didn't come until after the start of Chinese New Year.
You know, why aren't these countries being investigated? You know, so I'm just saying, look, there's a degree of openness. Every country has a degree of openness. And I think in comparison, China hasn't done so badly. All right. I mean, we have our own problems. I get it. We got problems. Okay. But I think one of the reasons why negative views of China have been rising in the rest of the world, in other parts of the world, especially in the West, that's linked to the coronavirus, is that debates like this one, the one you and I are having, are not being aired in Western societies enough.
Would this be aired in China?
I hope it needs to be aired in America.
It also needs to be aired in China.
The Chinese already know. The Chinese
I think this debate should be aired in China right now, so everybody can hear this.
Maybe it should be, but America and Europe need it much more.
好，这段访谈我们就先看到这里。这一步的对话可以说是比上一段更加深入，也更直接碰触了中西方在制度和理念上的核心差异。李世默特别强调他对中国特色的治理的理解，他认为像西方那种强烈对抗式的异界文化，对中国并没有太多帮助。中国内部其实也有自己的辩论和决策机制，而中共的合法性关键不是靠选举票数，而是它能不能实实在在为人民带来改善、带来发展，也就是所谓结果导向式的治理。在回应一下玻璃心这种西方常见的批评，还有新冠疫情初期资讯透明度的质疑时，李世默也没有闪躲，反而直接反击。 指出这些说法本身就带有偏见，甚至是双重标准。他这些观点无疑给我们提供一个跳出西方主流框架，重新看待中国政治的角度。不管你同不同意，他对民主、合法性这些概念的重新定义都很值得思考。至于这些解释是否真的能说明中国的全部现象，我相信每个人都有自己的判断。好，今天的节目就到这里，感谢大家收看，我们下次再见。